for being here. We're continuing our study in the book of Job. We're getting on toward the end of the book. We didn't quite get done last week. I was hoping we could, and we didn't quite get done with the speech by the man named Elihu. Now, remember, the three friends that came to Job initially were Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And they spoke. There were three cycles of speeches. Zophar didn't participate in the third cycle of speeches, but those three men and Job gave a back and forth three times. Each of them would speak, Job would respond. And that makes up the principal part of the book. But finally, the three men, I guess you would say they sort of threw up their hands. They gave up trying to convince Job that he was a sinner needing to repent. And chapter 32, verse 1, these three men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. So they decided they are not going to be able to convince Job and trying. And that's when this other fella, Elihu, speaks up. He says that he kind of kept quiet. He was listening to all that was going on back and forth. We don't know when he joined into that meeting. It doesn't say. Suddenly we see him on the scene, and he's upset. He's mad at Job, and he's mad at the three friends of Job as well, because he's mad at Job for declaring his innocence, and he's mad at his three friends because they haven't been able to provide any answers either. He's just really upset. And so he begins to speak there in chapter 32, and we talked about chapters 32 and 33 and 34 and 35. He keeps going. His speech is a little different than the others. I think he buys into the same proposition that they did, that the reason Job is suffering is because he's got sin that he hasn't addressed. But I think if you were going to sort of thumbnail sketch of Elihu's speech, his is more in defense of God. He wants to speak on God's behalf. He wants to uphold God's justice and righteousness because he feels that's been under attack, and he definitely feels that Job is guilty in that regard of not honoring God for his justice and righteousness. And so his address is more in that vein, and we talked about most of it last week. Go to chapter 36. Now, Elihu is still speaking. This is the younger of the four. There were the original three. They're done speaking. Then Elihu is speaking, and he's the younger. He's the fourth man to speak. He's younger than the others, trying to sort of speak up in God's defense. God is a good God. God is a righteous, just God. So in chapter 32, verse 1, Elihu also proceeded and said, suffer me a little, and I will show thee that I have yet to speak on God's behalf. I will fetch my knowledge from afar and will ascribe righteousness to my Maker. Notice that last phrase. I'm going to ascribe righteousness. God's a good, God's a just, God's a righteous God. And that's what he wanted to stress, speaking sort of in defense of God in that regard. In verse 5, he says, behold, God is mighty and despiseth not any. He is mighty in strength and wisdom. He preserveth not the life of the wicked, but giveth right to the poor. He withdraweth not his eyes from the righteous, but with kings are they on thrones. Yea, he doth establish them forever, and they are exalted. So he's a good God. He's a mighty God. He's a powerful God. He has strength and wisdom. Now, understand, he says, he doesn't favor the wicked, but those who are right, he giveth right to the poor. He withdraweth not his eyes from the righteous. God will bless those who do what is right. Look at verse 11, still in chapter 36, verse 11. If they obey and serve him, they shall spend their days in prosperity and their years in pleasures. But if they obey not, they shall perish by the sword, and they shall die without knowledge. Now again, I think you see in that he is of the same general mindset that the other three were, that if things are not going well for you, it's surely a sign that God is hidden his face from you, and he won't bless you, and you will suffer because of it. If you do right, he will bless you. Yeah, he doesn't take it to the same measure, I think, as the other three did. They were just adamant about that, and adamant in applying that notion to Job in particular. He doesn't seem to be attacking Job specifically like the others did, but I think he still generally holds to that view. What is the right view? Just sort of set us a baseline here. What would you say is the right view of how God treats in this? Okay, here we are in this present lifetime. How would you present the way God deals with righteous people, or at least people who are trying to do right, versus those who don't care at all about doing right? How would you summarize that? Anybody? Wayne, what does he do?
Well, God does bless the righteous, not always physically. And bad things happen to good people. So God doesn't put a hedge around people and keep bad things from happening. He does bless those that are righteous, and he does condemn the wicked. But I take a little different tack with Elihu. I think he is attacking Job. And I think he's attacking severely because he says, Job, your life is an affront to God.
Yeah.
Your life is an attack on God. And now I'm going to defend God because you're attacking him because you're claiming to be righteous when you've got all this sin hidden behind you.
Yeah, he feels a need to defend God for sure. And the reason he would feel that way is because he thinks Job has unfairly criticized God. But I do think that this is right. So we have to understand that, as Wayne said, good people do suffer in this lifetime. And if our perspective is just limited to here and now, then we're going to end up in a defeated state, because in the here and now, as we've said several times in our study, everybody's going to get sick and old and die. So if we just have a view of this, then that's the problem. When people get this idea, why is God doing this to me? Why is God treating me this way? It's surely an indication that they are just bound up in a here and now outlook. If we take the whole picture of eternity in view, it's definitely true. God blesses the righteous and punishes the wicked. In this present lifetime, sometimes bad things happen to good people. Jesus is the perfect example of it, the ultimate example of that. And sometimes in this lifetime, wicked people prosper. Sometimes very bad people have all kinds of worldly wealth and prosperity. So you can't limit your perspective to the here and now. And if you do, then you're going to have the conclusion you reach is not going to be accurate. But again, this Elihu, Monty?
I think part of our problem, even for Job, is that we're trying to live right, and we think of ourselves as righteous people. And maybe compared to the world, we are. But we've all sinned. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. Scripture's clear on that. So ultimately, we all deserve what Job got and more.
Yeah.
And so I think it's because our opinion of ourselves, we're too self-centered and too overinflated in our opinion of ourselves. And we think, I'm doing right, I deserve all these wonderful blessings. When what I deserve is to die and go to hell because I'm a sinner.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. Okay, so again, Elihu feels a strong urge and need to defend God because, as Wayne pointed out, he thinks Job has unjustly attacked God, and he's going to speak in behalf of God. Still in chapter 36, skip down to verse 24. In verse 24, remember that thou magnify his work, which men behold. Every man may see it, man may behold it afar off. Behold, God is great, and we know him not, neither can the number of his years be searched out. So, this is what he's saying. God is great. God is great beyond your ability, Job, or us either for that matter. God is great beyond our feeble minds' capacity to understand. God is great and powerful. His years can't be searched out. In other words, I think that's just a statement. It's more than your mind can comprehend concerning the goodness and power and might of God. A famous, still Elihu is in chapter 37. His speech continues. One of the verses that you often hear referenced is verse 14, 37:14. Hearken unto this, O Job, stand still and consider the wondrous works of God. That expression there in verse 14, stand still and consider the wondrous works of God. That's often quoted and repeated. He's just urging Job to come to his senses, so to speak. This business of you attacking God and speaking against God and criticizing God and blaming God, Job, you need to rethink that. God's a great, good, just God. You need to consider his wondrous works. And then he finally concludes. He spoke for a long time, and Job does not respond to him directly like he did the others. But at the end of chapter 37, verse 23, touching the Almighty, we cannot find him out. He is excellent in power and in judgment and in plenty of justice. He will not afflict. Men do therefore fear him. He respecteth not any that are wise of heart. And I think that last statement was certainly directed toward Job. God's not going to respect you if you're proud and arrogant and proclaiming your own self-righteousness. So, on our final exam, if we're going to give you a final exam on the book of Job, we would ask you, who were the first three who came? Can you remember the names? Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar. And then who was the fourth, the younger one who spoke up at the last? And that's Elihu. So, try to remember those names. We've been talking about them a lot. And maybe a few weeks from now, when we haven't been reviewing this week by week, they might begin to slip. But that's a pretty good piece of Bible information to keep in mind. Who were the men who spoke to Job? All right, now, from here to the end of the book, we finally hear God addressing this whole matter. And so, Elihu had been sitting off the side listening to what Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar said. And Elihu had been sitting off here to the side. He had heard all that, and he was not happy with what had been going on. You know who else had been sitting over here listening and observing to all this that's going on is God himself. And you get the idea that God's pretty frustrated at this point too. And he's going to address Job now. And so beginning in chapter 38, this is I think maybe the most interesting part of the book. And it's different. So we sort of changed gears. We've been just kind of going over the same things again and again and again. And beginning now in chapter 38 is a little bit of a change because now we're hearing from God, and God's going to approach this, and he's going to ask questions that Job is not going to be ready to answer. So in chapter 38, at verse 1, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said. I tried to picture that. Maybe some of you have an idea in your mind's eye. How does this look? God speaks out of the whirlwind. Well, sometimes we will see, just out in the middle of the field. Roger, you've no doubt seen in a dusty field, the wind just whip up and just spin out there and dust. It's not really a tornado. It's like a mini tornado. We call it a whirlwind, or sometimes I've heard people refer to them as a dust devil or something like that. But I checked several versions, and they all say the same thing. They all use the same word. They all say that God spoke out of the whirlwind. And so you have to imagine that physically there was this phenomenon that's not unusual. We see it pretty often, a whirlwind, and God speaks out of the whirlwind. So Job doesn't see God like in person, right? But he sees a manifestation of God. And so this whirlwind appears, and God speaks out of the whirlwind. So try to get that in your mind's eye if you can, what that might have been like. And he asked the question, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? He's talking to Job, right? Job, you don't know what you're talking. I think if we were going to say, who is this talking about stuff he doesn't even know, he has not got a clue. He doesn't know at all what he's talking about. Who is this guy? is God's approach. Verse 3, gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. In other words, get yourself prepared. Gird up your loins like a man. So, we understand that if a man in those days, then they wore the long robes, but if they were going to do physical work, or if they were engaged in a fight or a battle, they would draw up their long robes and tie them around their waist so that they'd be free to fight or work. And so basically the picture of that is he's saying, gird up the sort of the loins of your mind. Get yourself prepared. I'm going to challenge you, and I want you to answer. Wayne?
Doesn't that sound just like a father?
Yeah.
Stand up, quit complaining,
Yeah.
act like a man.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly. I think we've got to be a little bit careful there, but don't you sense God's frustration here? God's frustrated about this. And if God could be frustrated with Job, you think God gets frustrated with us? I think he does. When we're not doing what we ought to do, I think, and I don't want that, right? And I don't think you want that. We do not want God to be frustrated with us. But you get a picture here that God is certainly frustrated with Job, and if we bring that home, you have to believe he can get frustrated with us, Monty.
If you think about it, Job's been saying all along, if I could get an audience with God, I'd get an answer.
Yeah.
And God said, okay, you got your turn. Prepare yourself. I'm going to ask you questions, and you're going to get an answer.
Yeah, exactly right. James?
Similar thought that this is something that Job would desire. This is what he's asked for.
He's been asking for it.
A lot of times we think we can do things better than God, or we think we have a better way than God's plan, or we just don't understand. We think our way is always better. And that's what Job thought.
Yeah.
I'd
I'd like to have a word with God, and I'd like to tell him a few things.
And now he gets it.
Yeah.
We ask for things that we don't think we want.
Yeah. In reality, we can, and this has been stated in various ways in the book, we really can't even begin to comprehend God, the infinite, all-powerful God. Our pea brains are incapable of thinking at the level that God thinks at. And any time that we imagine that we can, we're just deceiving ourselves. And that's what we're going to see here. And Job's going to come to that realization here before this is done. Any other thoughts here? Josh?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Greg, you don't know how long it took to ask all these questions, but I mean, is this like rapid fire questions, or is this ask one question,
and then wait?
When I laid the foundations of the earth and just sat there a bit and waited for Job to try to think of something? Well, I don't know. And then ask the next one.
I had never considered that. I always thought it was probably rapid fire for the purpose of just overwhelming him. I'm going to overwhelm you with questions that you can't even begin to answer. And you got to kind of picture Job just on his heels here. He hasn't got any defense for what he's been saying. All right, so again, verse 3. I'm going to gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. And now just a succession of questions. Josh asked something I had never considered. Did he ask a question and then just pause for a little while to see if Job had an answer? Or did he just keep pouring the questions on? I always kind of thought the latter, that he just kept pouring the questions on. One of the famous questions starts out, where was thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. So right out of the box, God says, where were you when I made everything? When I created the earth? Where were you? Give me an answer. If you understand how this all was done, if you think you could operate at that level, give an answer if you have any understanding of these things. One of the amazing things that we always, or should often think about when we think about God's creation, the immensity of the universe, but the complexity even of minute things here on planet Earth. When we're always finding out new things, and things that work in our creation at the microscopic level, at the cellular level, all the intricacies of God's creation in the vastness of the universe, but also in the tiny little things that that make up our planet Earth. And you say, did that tax God's abilities? I mean, was he straining, to make all of that? Did he have to work overtime to figure out, how cells work and how he could make things interact? No. It didn't tax God's abilities at all. He was not strained, and it didn't challenge his, all-powerful, all-knowing presence. God spoke, and these things happened. He is so powerful, we can't even begin to imagine it. And that's the first question. Where were you? Where were you when I created everything? You got any understanding of that? Answer me if you can. And then I'm just going to kind of go pretty quickly down through this list, but this is a good, if you want to just read something that's very interesting and challenging. Kelly?
I like Isaiah 45, verse 9. "No one quarrels with his maker," which indicates maybe it's wrong for us to question God.
Yeah, quarrel with the maker. And that's what Job has done, basically. Exactly right. What was that, Isaiah?
45,
Well, Isaiah 45:9. Okay, that's a good cross-reference. Okay, so he says, skip down to verse 7. I'm going to skip pretty fast through this, but verse 7. "When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy." There's been some things written about the stars singing. Of course, we don't hear the stars singing, but in fairly recent times, scientists have been able to discover that that the heavenly bodies do emit sound waves. That there is we couldn't hear, we can't hear it here, but in space there are radio frequency sound waves that are produced by the various heavenly bodies. That might fall into the category of a little bit of scientific foreknowledge revealed here that men would not have known. Whoever wrote this down, whoever wrote this account, would not have been in a position to know anything about the stars singing or emitting sound waves. Skip down to verse 16. "Hast thou entered into the springs of the sea, or hast thou walked in the search of the depths?" Springs in the sea, again, would not have been known in the time of Job, now have been discovered. There are springs in the depths of the sea. Verse 19, "Where is the way where light dwelleth? And as for darkness, where is the place thereof?" Even the very basics of light and darkness. God, first thing God said in Genesis 1 was, "Let there be light," right? He created light. We've found out some things about light. We know a little bit about how light works and how it travels and the speed at which it travels and all, but they wouldn't have known anything about that in the time of Job. Verse 22, "Hast thou entered into the treasures of the snow, or hast thou seen the treasures of hail?" We understand that there is value to snow. I think even now we understand that it increases nitrogen. Roger, doesn't snow increase nitrogen levels in the soil? That's a beneficial thing. Nobody would have known that. 25, "Who hath divided a water course for the overflowing of waters, or the way for the lightning or thunder?" Lightning and thunder are pretty amazing things, and the intensity of lightning. Even when we see a common thunderstorm, we've come to know more about the power that's in the lightning. And of course, God made all of those processes and put them in place. Verse 26, "To cause it to rain on the earth where no man is, on the wilderness where there is no man." God waters the surface of the earth, even when there aren't men there to observe it happening. Verse 31, "Canst thou bind the sweet influences of the Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Canst thou bring forth Mazzaroth in his season, or canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons?" We talked about this earlier because there was a reference to the constellations, the heavenly bodies and the constellations of stars. These are Greek names. This is way before Greek times when this happened. And so some people want to throw that up as a challenge to the legitimacy of Job. And the simple understanding is that by the time these were translated and Greek influence was in place, then they provided the Greek names to the references to the constellations. You know, I think maybe, I forgot now, I didn't go back and look, but one of these constellations is known as the Bear. And they gave the Greek name for the constellation that is the Bear. So it's not a problem. It's understood that these names were added subsequently by various translators over time. But he's basically talking about, again, the stars and the heavenly bodies. Who made those? Did you do that, Job? You know anything about that, Job? Can you give me an answer about how all these things came into place? Verse 34, he says, "Canst thou lift up thy voice to the clouds, that abundance of water may cover thee? Can you make it rain? Can thou send lightnings that they may go and say to thee, here we are? Can you make it rain? Can you bring a thunderstorm? Can you just do the simple things that exist in our nature? We see them all the time, but they're beyond our power to control those things. Can you do that, Job?" And of course, again, you get the answer to all of this. Just boom, 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 rapid fire. Job, where were you when I did this? Can you duplicate this that I have put in place? All these kinds of questions. Nourishment for the wild beast, verse 39. "Wilt thou hunt the prey for the lion, or fill the appetite of the young lions, when they crouch in their dens and abide in the covert to lie in wait? Who provideth for the raven his food? When the young ones cry unto God, they wander for lack of meat." In other words, he even cares for the natural creation and the creatures that exist in nature. God cares for them. You do any of that, Job? Did you ever make sure that the lions had food to eat? Did you ever think about a raven? Make sure that the baby ravens had something to eat. God is saying, I do this. I did this. I'm in charge of this. And Job, you don't have a clue. You don't know anything about any of that. He keeps on as we get into chapter 39, more of the same. He says, "Knowest thou the time when the wild goats of the rock bring forth? Or canst thou mark when the hinds do calve? Canst thou number the months that they fulfill? Or knowest thou the time when they bring forth? They bow themselves, they bring forth their young ones, they cast out their sorrows. Their young ones are in good liking, they grow up with corn, they go forth and return not unto them." You know, something as common in nature as the reproduction of the wild beasts. You know anything about that, Job? God's saying, I made all that. And I oversee all that, and I bless all of that, and I keep, God sustains. One of the things to be remembered, God did not just create all of the physical creation. He sustains it, and He maintains it, and that's what He's challenging Job about here. Verse 5, "Who can send out the wild ass? Who hath sent out the wild ass free? Who looseth the bands of the wild ass?" And then now we've got a little bit of a question. Again, he's saying animals of nature God created and cares for. Here's a challenge. "Will the unicorn be willing to serve thee, or abide by thy crib? Canst thou bind the unicorn with his band in the furrow, or will he harrow the valleys after thee?" Unicorn, come on. Everybody knows unicorns are mythical creatures. And this acts like it's a real thing, that unicorns are a real thing. Again, I'm reading King James here. But the people who want to, the skeptic who wants to doubt the legitimacy of all of God's word, including the book of Job, would jump on that statement and so you want me to believe in unicorns, huh? That would be sort of the way they would go at that. I'm sure you're aware, if you're reading any other translation, it's not going to say unicorn. King James says unicorn, but like the English Standard, the New American Standard, they're going to say the wild ox. And so he's not talking about a unicorn here. So you might want to make a note in the margin that's not a good translation.
I was watching a video recently, and it was addressing this exact question. And actually, the word in the original language, when they
So it might be, it's not a unicorn. It's not a mythical unicorn, but it could be referenced to maybe a rhinoceros. But a lot of the newer translations say wild ox, and you could almost see wild ox, rhinoceros would be sort of similar in that sense. But just be aware, it's not the mythical unicorn, and don't let anybody try to throw this in the ditch because of that.
Well, if it was what we think of a unicorn, a horse with this horn coming out the center of its forehead, that wouldn't be unreasonable. And just because we don't have them anymore doesn't mean anything. We don't have dinosaurs anymore either.
Yeah.
Lots of things have gone extinct.
Yeah, but I think you can sort of trace unicorns to mythology, and that's the criticism, because this pertains to stories that men invented in mythology rather than in. And we don't have any, to my knowledge, we don't have any fossil records of the existence of unicorns, and so it just opens the door for criticism that's unjustified. Verse 13, and I'm going fast through this. Gavest thou the goodly wings unto the peacocks, or the wings and feathers unto the ostrich? No, obviously Job didn't, and he has to admit that, no, I didn't have anything to do with that. Verse 19, have thou given the horse strength? Hast thou clothed his neck with thunder? If you think about animals that men have brought into their service and use through the centuries, it's doubtful that there's any animal that likely compares with horses in regards to what men have been able to do by taming and training them to do work and to ride on them and to pull wagons and all that sort of thing. Did you give the horse the strength to do the kind of things that men have put them to work doing? No, obviously no. Verse 26, doth the hawk fly by thy wisdom and stretch her wings toward the south? Does the eagle mount up at thy command and make her nest on high? Again, obvious answers from Job would have to be, no, I didn't have anything to do with that. And so, again, just a whole list, a litany of questions that are poured upon Job. Job, you've been criticizing me. I'm the one who did all this. Did you do any of this? And Job obviously has no answer for any of that. And the answer to all of it would have to be, no, I didn't do that. I done it. Wayne?
Notice the difference between God's addressing of Job and his friends addressing him.
Yeah.
They're all blaming him for his sins. God's undone that. He's not saying, now this shows that you're sinful, Job.
Yeah.
But what happens is, and I think this shows that Job believed what their friends were saying, that God physically rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. But yet, I can't understand that because that's not happening in my case.
Yeah.
And so he's questioning the wisdom of God. And now God is laying before him his wisdom. Where were you when I was down here?
You don't even understand any of this stuff that I did. Basically, exactly right.
So God's not charging Job with anything, but he's just saying, you question my wisdom. And here's, see if you can even think of doing anything that I've done.
Yeah, you couldn't begin to even understand, much less do what I have done. Exactly right. So I guess if you were going to sort of summarize that, you'd say God is telling Job, you've crossed a line here. You've stepped out of bounds. What you're doing is not right, and your questioning of me and my wisdom, strength, justice, and righteousness is out of bounds. All right. So God's not done, and he's going to continue. Chapter 40, verse 1. Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? He that reproveth God, let him answer it. And so, as this goes on, he's certainly addressing Job. He notice, he that contendeth with the Almighty. Who's that? Well, that's Job. Will you instruct Job? You're going to tell me? You're going to instruct me? You're going to tell me how it is? He that reproveth God, Job, you're the one. You've been reproving God. Answer these questions that have been asked. And in verse 3, Job gets a word in. I guess you could say Job gets a word in edgewise here because God's not done challenging him. But in verse 3, Job answered the Lord and said, Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer thee? I will lay my hand upon my mouth. Once have I spoken, but I will not answer. Yea, twice, but I will proceed no further. So Job has already got the point, right? God's not done with him yet, but Job has gotten the point. I don't have an answer. I'm vile. I can't answer you. I don't have an answer. What should I answer that? I'll put my hand on my mouth. I was foolish enough to speak. I did it once. I did it twice. But I'm going to tell you, I will not do that again. I will go no further in criticizing you, all-powerful God. So Job, that's all Job gets to say before God begins again. In verse 5, skip down to verse. So the Lord spoke to Job out of the whirlwind and said, Gird up thy loins now like a man. I will demand of thee, and declare thou unto me. Wilt thou also disannul my judgment? Wilt thou condemn me, that thou mayest be righteous? Now, I think this is kind of interesting. Job, you can't answer me about physical creation. You don't have a response to me just concerning things in the physical world and in the universe that I have made and that I maintain and that I keep functioning. You don't have an answer. You just admitted you don't have an answer. And so let me ask you, you can't answer those questions. Are you going to disannul my judgment? In other words, you don't have an answer to the things I've done. And would you presume to question my justice and judgment? Wilt thou condemn me, that thou mayest be righteous? Will you say that you're good, you have to make me bad in order to make yourself look good? You can do that, Job? When you can't even answer or even begin to imagine the things that I have done. There is a tendency, I think humans have this tendency, that sometimes sometimes you try to make the other guy look bad so that you can look good, right? And doesn't that happen a lot in interpersonal relationships? If I can make you look bad, I might do that with the hopes it'll make me look better. I'm going to make me look smarter, make me look wiser. It's a wrong approach, certainly, but that's what he says Job has basically done. You're going to condemn me so that you can declare your own righteousness? So he continues here. In verses 8 and 9, he asks Job these things. Verse 8, Wilt thou disannul my judgment? Wilt thou condemn me, that thou mayest be righteous? Hast thou an arm like God, or canst thou thunder with a voice like him? You're not on the same level here, Job. You need to really watch your step, because you are not on the right level, or on the same level with God. Skip down to verse 10. Verse 10, Deck thyself now with majesty and excellency, array thyself with glory and beauty, cast abroad the rage of thy wrath. Behold everyone that is proud, and abase him. Look on everyone that is proud, and bring him low. Tread down the wicked in their place, hide them in the dust together, bind their faces in secret. So he's saying, in regards to how I deal with men, can you deal with men like I deal with men? Again, another challenge to Job. Job's not able. Job can't function at that level. But the challenge is put forth. Not only you can't do the physical things I've done, and you can't deal with men like I deal with men, is what God is telling him. The next part of this is really interesting, and we want to challenge one another's thinking about this. Starting in verse 15, Behold now behemoth, which I made with thee. In other words, I made the behemoth at the same time I made you. When I created all things, I created you. I created the behemoth, he says. He eateth grass as an ox. Lo, now his strength is in his loins, and his force is in the navel of his belly. He moveth his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his stones are wrapped together. His bones are as strong pieces of brass. His bones are like bars of iron. He is the chief of the ways of God. He that made him can make his sword to approach unto him. In those verses, well, let's keep reading. He is the chief of the ways of God, verse 19. He that made him can make his sword to approach him. Surely the mountains bring him forth food where all the beasts of the field play. He lieth under the shady trees in the covert of the reed and fens. The shady trees cover him with their shadow. The willows of the brook compass him about. Behold, he drinketh up a river and hasteth not. He trusteth that he can draw up Jordan into his mouth. He taketh it with his eyes. His nose pierceth through snares. All right. So we're just out of time. What is this behemoth? What is this behemoth? Well, let me tell you what many people have tried to say that this behemoth is the hippopotamus, because this is talking about some creature that apparently dwells in swampy places. So the picture described there of the environment of this beast is sort of in a swampy kind of setting. What about a hippopotamus?
They have a small tail.
They have almost no tail. They have a tail like a pig. There's a little curly tail. Like this says he moveth his tail like a cedar. His tail like a tree swinging around back there. What is this behemoth? Money?
The description reminds me of a dinosaur that we would call a brontosaurus. He's got a long neck. He's not worried about the river that's floating in his face because his neck's above it. He's got a long tail. The description we see of him has huge hips and thighs as it talks about here. It's just a description of a large dinosaur.
I think so too. I think that this is describing a dinosaur. I think I can say with full confidence it's not describing a hippopotamus. It doesn't fit the description of hippopotamus at all, but it does fit the description of a dinosaur. Now, that brings to light a question. Well, how would Job know anything about dinosaurs? Because the evolutionist tells us dinosaurs became extinct 65 million years ago. Modern man didn't evolve onto the scene until about 4 million years ago. Dinosaurs had been gone from the earth for over 60 million years before modern man evolved. That's their argument, right? Of course, we don't believe anything about the way the evolutionists date the earth. There's plenty of evidence that human beings were aware of dinosaurs. I mean, there's cave drawings and all kinds of evidence that humans lived in the same time that dinosaurs lived. Now, Job, the book of Job, is dealing with a man who lived after the flood, right? So this is after the flood. And so I would argue that did the dinosaurs survive the flood? I think so. I think they did. Why aren't there dinosaurs today? Well, they've become extinct since then. Lots of animal species have become extinct since the time of the flood. But I think there's strong evidence, and I don't know if you remember, Clayton taught us a lesson about dinosaurs a couple of years ago. And he presented really good documentation on the fact that certainly men lived in the same time as the dinosaurs, and there's all kinds of evidence worldwide that indicates that that is the case. And so you might remember here when you're reading through this in the future, when it talks about the behemoth, almost certainly he's talking about dinosaurs. Wayne?
We went to the Creation Museum in Texas, and there's a picture of a dinosaur print with a human print.
Yeah.
Footprint.
Yeah, there's some places.
It's not it wasn't a picture, it was a cast.
Yeah, because it was in a muddy place, and then it solidified. And Glen Rose, Texas. Glen Rose, Texas is where they have this ancient riverbed that's now turned into sedimentary rock, and clearly dinosaur footprints and human footprints crossing over them in the same strata. Men lived during the time of dinosaurs. Not now, obviously, but there was a time when it was so. Okay, now, to give you a little bit of tease, and we might get done with Job next week, possibly, we'll see. But to give you a little tease about what's coming up, he's going to talk about Leviathan. in chapter 41. Do your research and tell me next week when we start, what about that Leviathan? What was the Leviathan? We'll talk about that next week. Thanks.